Hey everyone, welcome to this Engage session. I'm Carl with Google's Developer Relations team, and I'm joined by Sarah. Say hi, Sarah.
Hey everyone.
So today we're going to talk about deploying and explaining your model. We also have a special treat for you today. We have live interactions available, and we want to hear from you throughout the session. So please fire away on those emojis. Looks like we are already off to a great start on those. Jump into the chat, and we hope you enjoy some of the polls and quizzes we're going to have in store for you. So let's start with one of those. So does that sound good, Sarah?
Yep, that sounds great. So check out the poll on your screen below and let us know who you are. Vertex AI is intended for lots of different types of roles and varying levels of ML expertise. So we've got something for everyone today.
So don't be shy, fill out the poll. Oh, we've got it, the data coming in already. Data scientists pulling up in front here so far, but we've got a nice mix. ML engineers going up as well here. And, you know, in the machine learning field, really some of the roles are blended here. So I know it's hard to pick one sometimes, but anyway, it looks like data scientists are up front. Awesome. No worries. We have something in store for everyone. So let's go ahead and get started. So our agenda today, we're going to cover first deploying a model. That's a model that you already have and you want to put it in the cloud and use it. Secondly, we're going to cover explainability. How do you take a model that you've deployed and understand how it works under the covers? We're going to then turn it over to Sarah for a demo. She's going to walk through all these concepts, and most importantly, we're going to have a few minutes to have a live chat with all of you at the end. So first, what's included in Vertex AI? Not going to go through all of this here, but I just want to point out that this is an end-to-end platform that helps you at each stage of the process. And in this session, we're going to focus on the deployment and explainability pieces.
So there are a lot of different tools covered in Vertex AI, but I'm curious to hear what people in the audience are interested in learning about today. So let us know in the poll below.
So poll number 2, y'all are becoming experts at this point. Let's see, the numbers are coming in here. Explainability, a real sort of tight race between a few of these here. Okay. Well, my personal favorite is explainability. I just think it's fascinating trying to understand how models work. Sarah, any other suggestions here?
Yeah, I'm excited to learn about using the Vertex AI SDK, which we'll cover later on.
All right, so let's get that vote in. And looks like the winner is explaining model predictions. Awesome. So let's walk through first the deployment process in Vertex AI. So we're going to show you from end to end, given a model that can come from a variety of different places. How do you manage it? How do you then deploy it to an endpoint so it can be used? And then once you have that endpoint, what are the different ways that you can make predictions with your model? We're going to talk about 2 different types, online and batch predictions. So our starting point for today's session is a trained model. There are other sessions here today where we get into how to build an AutoML model, how to build a custom trained model. Those are really interesting topics. So we're going to take it from there. So say that you've got a list of your models showing up here in Vertex. Here we see a screenshot of what that might look like. So that's our starting point today. Now, you could take models from elsewhere, for instance, from BigQuery ML, if you happen to use that. It's as simple as a 2-step process to export the model and then import the model into Vertex AI, and it'll show up in your list of models. So once you've got models in Vertex AI, I want to give you a little pro tip, which is the number of models could become quite large if you're using it for all different types, all different kinds of problems you're trying to solve. So metadata can be your friend. These little labels that you see here in this screenshot allow you to say what part of a project is it associated with team, what type of model it is, and that'll allow you to filter and sort and have an inbox of models that is focused on what you need. So once you have your models in Vertex, how do you deploy to an endpoint? So let's show you via the UI how that works. You would go to the model itself, click deploy to endpoint, and then you have a simple set of steps where you can specify some information here. First is traffic split. So we actually allow you to deploy multiple models to one endpoint. So if you're doing some experimentation, you might have a new version of a model that you're not quite comfortable with, but you want to get it out there. You could devote a little bit of your traffic to that model, sort of like A/B testing, if you're familiar with that concept. You're also going to see information about auto scaling. So you can specify a minimum number of nodes and a maximum number of nodes to serve predictions to your users. And that's very valuable because you can get the amount of infrastructure just right, right? So Vertex AI will look at the loads coming in that could be very spiky. And as more people are using your model, you're going to provision more servers. And when they're not, they'll provision it back down. You can also set it to some fixed limits if you'd like to do that as well. So there are some other options such as machine types and region as well in this wizard. So now let's talk about our data set. So of all things, we're going to talk about beans today. So let's just start with a poll. Our next poll is about your favorite bean dish. Let's have some fun here.
Personally, my favorite is bean dip.
Oh, that's always good. It's around lunchtime here, so I'm just getting hungry watching this. Burritos, chili, those are kind of in front here for the lead. It's going to be tight between burritos and chili. Let's see. So Sarah, while folks are getting their votes in, I know that you've done a lot when it comes to where the intersection of food and machine learning. Maybe you could tell the audience a little bit about that.
Yeah, so over the past year, I've been baking a lot, and I started to notice that there are pretty distinct patterns in different types of baked goods. So, for example, the ratio of flour, fat, and sugar is what distinguishes a cake from a cookie or a bread. So, I thought this would be a great fit for machine learning and experimented with building some models to both classify the type of recipe based on the ingredients and also to generate recipes. Check out the link in the chat if you want to learn more. And back to you, Carl.
Awesome. That sounds great. So let's talk about this particular data set for a second. Sarah will show you in more detail. This is called a classification problem, which means we're going to take some raw data, we're going to learn some patterns from it so that we can figure out which category or class something belongs into. So in this case, we're looking at different measurements of beans, their roundness, their size, etc. And based on that information, the machine learning model is going to figure out what type of bean it is. So that's what we're doing. We're working with tabular data in today's example. All right, so now that we've talked about our example, let's move on to how to use the SDK. So how do we deploy with our Python SDK? So your first step is you're going to import the library. The next step I want to show you here is how do you retrieve a model? So you just pass in this string, which is your combined your project information, your location, and the model ID. That's what was showing up in that list of models before. You just plug in that ID. And from there, you can have a model object that you can perform all kinds of operations with. So what we're going to do next here in this code sample is we're going to deploy the model to an endpoint. You can specify some optional parameters, things like the machine type, the GPU accelerator that you might want to attach, and simply just say model.deploy, and you're going to come up with an endpoint that you can now use. And this creates a new endpoint, but you could even pass in an endpoint to model deploy, and then you can deploy to an existing endpoint. That's how it works. So let's look at after you've deployed your model to an endpoint, you're going to see it in the user interface. Here we see a management console with information like the amount of predictions per second over time. My model hasn't been used a lot. I hope to fill that screen up. And you also see the various models deployed as well. Notice my traffic split's 100%, but we could have multiple models there. Finally, we could see things like logs and even sample requests where we can see how do you interact with this model there at the endpoint. That's the endpoint screen. So once we have an endpoint, how do we use it? So there are two different ways. One is an online prediction, and this is where you need an answer back immediately. So if, say during Sarah's demo, she was to create a web application where she has users enter bean measurements and you want to answer right away, you'd use an online prediction. But if we're doing something like that we have a massive number of beans and we don't really need an answer today, or rather right this second, we're going to run a batch prediction. In a batch prediction, you have your input location of all of the inputs, and then you say where to output the predictions when you're done. So let's look at that in the SDK. So we can retrieve an endpoint in the same way that we did with models. We specify that resource string, and we call AI platform.endpoint, and we'll have that endpoint. To predict, you simply say endpoint.predict, and here's where we pass in the inputs to our model. So if we're trying to figure out which type of bean it is, we might pass in these different measurements on the bean, and then we're going to get back the answer. So let's talk about batch prediction. Batch prediction actually provides you a user interface. So from the batch prediction in the left nav bar, you click create, and then it walks you through a couple steps in terms of the location of your inputs. Those could be, say, CSV among other formats in cloud storage. And you could say where you want to output the location as well. So let's take a look in the SDK here. This example shows a batch prediction with our inputs in Google Cloud Storage and a CSV, and then our output actually to a BigQuery table there. So that's how it works. So you just saw that there were two different ways of performing batch predictions.
So Carl, I am curious to hear from the audience if they prefer working in the SDK or the console. We just fired another poll, so let us know below. Personally, for me, it kind of depends on the day and the project. Some things are better in the UI and some things are optimized for the SDK. What do you think, Carl?
Yeah, this is a tough one. I think both are useful for different purposes. I mean, whenever I'm learning something new, I'm kind of a visual person. I'm going to look at the user interface, understand the concepts. But when I'm trying to put something into production, or I'm doing something over and over again, the SDK is great to just, you're in your Jupyter notebook, just click, just make it happen. So yeah, it looks like, yeah, we're seeing sort of a split here. SDK in the lead so far. Yep, so SDK took the lead. Yeah, so yeah, great point, Sarah. Both are valuable in their own way. You can see the simple APIs so that you can perform these different operations of the SDK. Let's switch gears to explainability now. So I want to just tell a quick story about where there's a paper that describes this, where they were building models of, say, classifying which animal is in a picture. And what they were finding was that errors were occurring where there were dogs showing up in the wintertime. They were always showing up as wolves. And why was that? That was because the training data was always showing the wolves with a snowy background and the dogs in more of a daytime summer type of background. And that's an example of where you think your model is being trained a certain way, but really what it was doing was learning from the background rather than the animal. So explainability can tell you a lot, not only after you've built your model, but along the way to really understand why it's doing what it's doing. And so it works with multiple types of data, right? So images, as I just described, kind of that heat map idea of understanding where it's focusing. Tabular data, so that you're looking at, say, with their beans data, is it the size or the roundness, or which factors are the most important to determine which type of bean it is? And finally, even text data, where we can look at a sentence and maybe say which of the words are the most important to the prediction. And so when you look at tabular data, there's global and local types of feature importances. Global meaning for the model as a whole, in general, which are the most important features. But also you can look at an individual prediction, like in the case of the dog, for that specific image, which factors are the most important. You can look at that as well. So I was showing you some capability built into AutoML, but if you're using custom models, within a notebook, you can import the Explainability SDK, and then you can get to the same information. You could also use the what if tool to dive in a little deeper. So let's look at how you would use the SDK for that. When you deploy to an endpoint, you would pass in a couple more pieces of information, some explainability metadata and parameters. Both of these are described in a little more detail in the docs. Once you've done that, you have an endpoint with explainability turned on. You simply can call endpoint.explain, and then you can get those explanations back from the SDK. That's for online predictions. If you're doing batch predictions, similar, you just add an extra optional parameter called generate explanation. And say in that case of printing out to the BigQuery table, we just see some additional information there about the explanations along with our predictions. All right, so we're here to the fun part. So the concepts we talked about we're going to walk through those in the demo flow. So now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, who's going to walk us through this demo.
Thanks, Carl. So before I dive in, a quick overview of what I'm going to show you. I'm going to start out by showing you how to import models in the Vertex AI console. Then we'll head over to a notebook and focus on using the SDK. I'll show you how to deploy and explain models with the SDK. And then finally, we'll end on batch predictions. So let's roll to the demo. Great. So what we have here, first I want to show you how to import models to Vertex AI that were trained elsewhere. So for this, I have a model that I've trained in BigQuery machine learning and BQML, again, using the Beans dataset that Carl introduced. So we can see that I have a pretty good model here. I would like to export this and import it into Vertex AI. So all I need to do that is I want to click this Export Model button. Then I'm going to input the location in Google Cloud Storage where I want BigQuery to write this model to. For this model, I've already got it exported. As you can see over here, it's exported it in the TensorFlow saved model format. And then to import that to Vertex AI, all I need to do is go to my Models tab in Vertex AI, click on this Import button, then I would give my model a name and enter some settings. I already have a version of this model uploaded, and you can see that here. And I want to show you how I could deploy that to an endpoint in the UI. So what I would do is just click this Deploy to Endpoint button. I'm going to give it a name V4 since my last one was V3. Great name. I'm going to choose a machine type. I'm going to go with N1 standard 4, and I'm going to hit Done, Continue, and Deploy. And that's it. And I should see a pending deploy right there. So that's how this works in the console. Next, I want to focus on how you can do some of these things using the SDK. And for that, I'm going to use our hosted Jupyter Lab notebook service. To use this, you can create a new notebook instance. You'll choose the frameworks that you'd like pre-installed, and you can, of course, install additional frameworks as well. So I already have a TensorFlow instance that I've created, and I'm going to hit this Open Jupyter Lab button to open my notebook. So now I have my notebook instance. I've already imported some libraries that I'm going to be using. And then as we saw in the slides, we just need to import the Vertex AI SDK. So I'm going to run those cells. And then I want to show you what I just showed you in the console, but how you would do that programmatically via the SDK. So I'm going to change the display name of this model. I'm going to give it today's date and the current time where I am. As you can see, I've included the Google Cloud Storage location where these model assets are, along with the serving container image that I want to use. So I'm going to run this cell. And if I head over to the Models tab when that completes and refresh, I should see that model that I just created now available in the console. So as you can see, there's no endpoints here yet. To create one, all I need to do is call model.deploy. I can pass in some other parameters here too, but for now I'm just including the machine type. So now if I refresh this page, I should be able to see that pending deploy. All right, so that looks good. I'm going to stop this cell for now and move to the next section. So we talked about how you can import models to Vertex AI that were trained elsewhere. But you can also take a model training job that you ran on Vertex AI and use that to deploy a model to an endpoint. So I'm not going to run this code. I've already run this training job, but I just want to show you what this would look like. So I started out by creating a data set. I then created a training job. This happens to be a distributed training job. You can check out some other sessions at the summit to learn more about training. We're not going to focus on that here. But notice that I call this custom model. And to deploy this to an endpoint, all I need to do is call custom model.deploy. Before I get into explanations, though, I want to pass it back to Carl for a quick knowledge check.
So what you just saw in Sarah's demo was taking a trained model and deploying it. But I want to see if y'all are paying attention. So let's quiz the audience. And remember, you can answer the question right now below. So here it is. do you need to train your model on Vertex AI to be able to deploy it to an endpoint? Do you need to train your model on Vertex AI to deploy it to an endpoint?
Let's see who's paying attention.
Don't be shy. This isn't school. No, nobody knows your answers. Let's
No
see what
judgment.
happens. Yeah. Okay. So it looks like most folks said no. And that is, well, once we close the poll here, that is a correct answer. So it's a little bit of a trick question. You can train your model in Vertex AI and deploy it, but you can also import your model from elsewhere. We saw, in the slides, a BQML model and other types of models you can use as well. So great. Glad to see you all are paying attention. I'm going to pass it back to Sarah for the rest of our live demo now.
Thanks, Carl. So next I want to show you how to deploy a model with explanations enabled. So this looks pretty similar to a regular endpoint deployment, but you're going to need to add some explanation metadata. So I have the code for that here. This includes choosing the explanation method that you'd like to use. There are a few different ones to choose from. They're based on publicly available research. You can check out the papers if you'd like. And I also need to provide some metadata so that the explanation service knows a little bit more about my model. So then you'll notice here to deploy this, the code looks pretty similar to before, but I've added these two parameters, explanation metadata and explanation parameters there. So once that runs, I have a deployed model with explanations enabled. So I've already deployed that model. Next, I want to show you how to get predictions. So I have a test bean example here. This is a dermasone bean, and we're going to see if our model is able to classify it correctly. So I'm going to create a reference to my endpoint here. I just need to pass in a string indicating the project ID and the endpoint ID and the location of this model endpoint. So I'll create a reference to that. And before I get an explanation, I'm just going to call this .predict method, and we'll see what my model predicts here. Okay, looks like it predicted the correct type of bean. So that is good news with 99% confidence. But I want to go a little bit deeper, and I want to know why my model classified this bean to make sure that it's picking up on the right signals. So this is where explanations comes in really handy. All I need to do is change that predict method to explain, and I can get an explanation on this model. And that's going to be in the form of feature attributions. So I'm going to skip to this cell where we're going to visualize what the feature attributions in that response were in this nice little table. The feature attribution values tell you which features signaled your model's prediction the most. So you want to look at the attribution values that have the highest absolute value or magnitude. In this case, it looks like the minor axis length of the bean caused our prediction confidence to increase by 25%, followed by parameter was the next most important feature. So that is explanations. The last thing I want to show you is how you can use the Vertex AI SDK to get batch predictions on your model. You actually don't need to deploy your model to an endpoint to get batch predictions. So the first thing I will do is create a reference to this model resource. I'm going to change the display name for my batch prediction job to the current timestamp, and I will run this. Here I'm just passing it the display name, the Google Cloud Storage location of my examples for batch prediction, and then the location in cloud storage where I want Vertex AI to write the resulting predictions. So if I go over here to the batch prediction section of the console, hit refresh, I should see that pending job there, which looks great. We won't wait for that job to complete, but let's take a look at the results of my last successful completed batch prediction job. So we can see here that I sent 73 items for prediction. I got 64 back. That was my bad. There were some errors in the format of my examples. So the good news is Vertex AI told me about that, so I can fix it for my next batch prediction run. It also tells me where it wrote the output. So if I go over here and click on this, I can see the resulting batch predictions. Now there's a lot of text here, but basically what you want to pay attention to is that for each example, it gave us a prediction in the form of a softmax array. So I've just shown you how to get batch predictions and kick off a batch prediction job with the Vertex AI SDK. And with that, I want to pass it back to Carl for some wrap up.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Great demo. Let's just talk about a couple quick resources. If you want to find out more about Vertex AI, you're going to see the URL right there, cloud.google.com/Vertex AI. And also, I want to point you to a best practices guide. So once you've started using Vertex, this has some great suggestions on practical ideas for rolling out machine learning. So we're now at the end of the demo, but it's not the end of our session. And this is my favorite part. We're going to take some live questions in the chat now. So please fire away. And I see a couple coming in already. Okay, so what is the difference between AI platform and Vertex AI? Vertex AI is the next generation of the cloud AI platform. What you saw today was we unified the workflow from start to finish in a set of sequential steps. We combined AutoML and custom models into that workflow, and we added a lot of new MLOps capability. That not all described in this session, but that's part of the whole platform in Vertex AI.
Yeah, so it looks like there's another question coming in. I'm going to take this one. How can I automate model deployment with Vertex pipelines? That's a great question. So Vertex pipelines we didn't cover today. There's another great session on that. But that lets you orchestrate and automate end-to-end machine learning workflows by splitting your workflow into components. So you could absolutely have a component in your pipeline that's in charge of deploying models to Vertex AI. You could even create some logic around that. So let's say, for example, that you only wanted to deploy your model if the new model had an accuracy above a certain threshold. You could do that, and in that way use Vertex pipelines to automate your model deployment.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, all of what you saw today, you can automate those steps with Vertex pipelines. Wow, lots of questions. We'll do our best to handle what we can here. So Sarah, there's a question about explainability. Like, is explainability available for all different kinds of models? What are your thoughts on which different model types we support for explainability?
Yeah, so there are a few different types supported. If you have a custom model, so a model that you've written the model code for yourself, you could use Explainable AI for image, text, and tabular models. We also have Explainable AI support out of the box for tabular data models that you train with AutoML. So if you train your model with AutoML in Vertex AI, you'll be able to see in the UI aggregate results for feature importance across your model. And you can also get that with the Vertex AI SDK. Anything to add there, Carl?
No, that sounds great. Yeah, I think in the demo we saw how integrated it is with the SDK. So just .explain on multiple model types. There's a lot of questions on feature store, I'm noticing. We're not covering that here, but yes, that is one of the important new capabilities in Vertex AI. So that allows you, if you have features like, let's say you've done some data engineering on those Beam features, let's say, and you want to share it with all of the other data scientists in your organization, you can create a feature store. Think of those as building blocks where you're taking a feature that's taken a little work to build, and you're exposing that so you can put in all kinds of models. And then when you deploy models, like we're discussing today, you can actually pull from that feature store to make your predictions.
I saw another good question on Vertex pipelines asking about how Kubeflow relates. So that's a good question. With Vertex pipelines, it lets you run pipelines that were written in either Kubeflow pipelines or TensorFlow extended. So both open source SDKs for building end-to-end machine learning pipelines. So you can take that code, those familiar libraries, and run those on Vertex pipelines. Let's see what else we've got. Looks like we may actually be out of time for questions. Anything else to add, Carl?
No, that was great. Glad we could interact with all of you. And one last question here about Vertex AI. It is the future, as somebody asked, but it is also the present. So it is GA. You can use it today. Love if you want to get started on that. All right, so we want to go ahead and wrap up. Thank you so much for today. I hope that you learned a lot. Thank you, audience. Thank you, Sarah. Please feel free to hit us up on Twitter or LinkedIn if you want to continue the conversation. Hope you have a great rest of your day and enjoy the rest of the sessions. Thank you.